In 1982, the Palestine Liberation Organization was forced into exile. After years of fighting in Lebanon, Yasser Arafat and his fighters boarded ships for Tunisia, thousands of kilometers from the land they longed to liberate. For the first time since its founding, the PLO had no foothold near Israel's borders, but while its leaders operated from afar, life for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza grew harsher. Israel tightened its grip on the occupied territories, military checkpoints multiplied, land confiscations accelerated, and Jewish settlements expanded across the hills. For many Palestinians, despair became a daily companion. A new generation came of age under occupation. These were the children of refugees, too young to remember 1948, but old enough to feel the weight of statelessness and the absence of hope. As the PLO's influence waned in the streets of Nablus and Gaza, a different kind of resistance was quietly building. It would soon erupt not from distant capitals, but from the alleys and refugee camps of Palestine itself. In December 1987, an Israeli military truck hit a group of Palestinian workers in Gaza, killing 4. The incident triggered widespread protests across the occupied territories. The uprising, later called the First Intifada, began in refugee camps, like Joblia, and spread to cities such as Nablus, Hebron, and Jenin. Palestinians organized strikes, boycotted Israeli goods, and clashed with soldiers. Children threw stones at military vehicles. Some militants attacked settlers and soldiers. With knives and guns, the Israeli army imposed curfews and used tear gas, rubber bullets, and live fire. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed. Around 100 Israelis, including settlers, were also killed in attacks. The uprising drew global attention. The United States and Western Europe urged Israel to show restraint, but kept supporting its government. The Soviet Union called for an Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories. Arab states expressed solidarity but offered little concrete help. As the violence grew, Israel expanded settlements and deployed more troops to protect settlers. The Intifada transformed the conflict and forced the world to take notice. During the First Intifada, a new force emerged in Gaza. Hamas, founded in 1987 as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas rejected the PLO's secular nationalism. While the PLO moved toward diplomacy, Hamas called for the destruction of Israel and the creation of an Islamic state in all of historic Palestine. It began organizing social programs, mosques, and schools, winning support among Gaza's poor. But Hamas also built a militant wing, carrying out attacks against Israeli soldiers and settlers. This marked the start of a deep divide in Palestinian society between the older, secular PLO and the younger, Islamist Hamas. In 1993, secret talks between Israel and the PLO produced a breakthrough, the Oslo Accords. For the first time, Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. In return, the PLO accepted Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism as part of the deal. Israel withdrew from most of the Gaza Strip, allowing the newly created Palestinian Authority to take control. Palestinian police replaced Israeli troops in Gaza's cities and refugee camps. On the West Bank, the territory was divided into 3 zones. Area A, 18%, under full Palestinian control. Area B, 21%, with Palestinian civil authority and Israeli military oversight. Area C, 61%, remaining under complete Israeli control. The agreement envisioned a 5-year transition period and final status talks on Jerusalem, refugees, and borders. On September 13, 1993, Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands on the White House lawn, an image that seemed to promise a new era. In 1994, Israel signed a peace treaty with Jordan, becoming only the second Arab country to recognize Israel after Egypt. For Jordan, the deal secured its western border and ended decades of hostilities. King Hussein also gained international legitimacy and U.S. economic support, over $1 billion in debt relief and new investments. For Israel, the agreement meant a quiet Eastern Front and normalized ties with a key neighbor. The treaty settled border disputes and allowed Israel access to Jordanian airspace and trade routes. The treaty was signed on October 26, 1994, at the Arava Valley border, with U.S. President Bill Clinton attending the ceremony. The United States and Norway had facilitated the talks, but the two countries reached the deal directly. In the Arab world, Jordan's decision was controversial. Many saw it as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. Yet despite tensions over Jerusalem and settlements, the Israel-Jordan peace has largely held to this day. The peace agreements with the Palestinians and Jordan sparked hope across the world, but also fury at home in Israel. Right-wing groups accused Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of betraying Jewish claims to the land. They saw the Oslo Accords as a surrender to terrorism. Protests erupted, with some extremists depicting Rabin in Nazi uniform and calling for his death. In Palestinian society, opposition grew as well. Hamas and Islamic Jihad denounced Oslo and launched suicide bombings against Israeli civilians, seeking to derail the peace process. On November 4, 1995, tragedy struck. At a peace rally in Tel Aviv, Rabin was shot dead by an Israeli ultranationalist. The assassination shocked Israel and the world and dealt a devastating blow to the fragile peace process. In July 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton invited Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO leader Yasser Arafat to Camp David. The goal, a final peace agreement. Israel offered to withdraw from most of the West Bank and Gaza, but key issues remained unresolved. The plan left Israel in control of parts of East Jerusalem and rejected the return of Palestinian refugees. Arafat refused, saying it was not enough. December 2000, Clinton presented a revised proposal. This time, both sides showed signs of compromise. At new talks in Taba, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators came closer to an agreement than ever before, but the window closed quickly. In February 2001, Ariel Sharon and the Israeli right wing came to power and froze all negotiations. Meanwhile, Hamas rejected all peace efforts and escalated suicide bombings. Years earlier, Israel had tolerated Hamas's rise in Gaza, seeing it as a counterweight to the secular PLO. Now, that calculation had backfired. In September 2000, Ariel Sharon, just months before becoming Israel's prime minister, visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. To Palestinians, the visit was seen as a provocation. Protests erupted in the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli forces opened fire on demonstrators. The violence escalated into the Second Intifada. Unlike the first uprising, it involved suicide bombings, armed attacks, and Israeli airstrikes. Militants targeted buses, cafes, and markets. Hamas and Islamic Jihad led many of the attacks. Israel responded with overwhelming force. The army reoccupied West Bank cities, imposed curfews, and launched targeted assassinations of Palestinian leaders. In 2002, after a wave of suicide bombings, Israel began constructing a massive barrier around the West Bank. It combined fences, trenches, and concrete walls. Israel called it a security measure to prevent attacks. Palestinians saw it as a land grab, cutting off communities from farmland, water, and each other. The Intifada left over 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis dead. By 2005, the uprising had burned itself out, leaving both societies deeply scarred and the peace process in ruins. In 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon launched a unilateral plan to withdraw from Gaza. Israeli soldiers and settlers were evacuated, and all 21 settlements in the Strip were dismantled. Sharon hoped this move would improve Israel's security and freeze the peace process, but the withdrawal left Gaza in a power vacuum. In 2006, Palestinians held elections. Hamas won a surprise victory, defeating the long-dominant Fatah party. The Islamist group formed a new government, but Israel, the United States, and the European Union refused to recognize it. Tensions between Fatah and Hamas quickly spiraled into violence. In June 2007, Hamas fighters seized control of Gaza after a week of brutal street battles. The Palestinian territories were now split in two. Fatah ruled the West Bank, while Hamas controlled Gaza. After Hamas seized Gaza in 2007, Israel and Egypt imposed a strict blockade on the territory. Goods, fuel, and people were heavily restricted. Israel said the blockade was needed to stop weapons smuggling and rocket attacks. But for Gaza's 2 million residents, the blockade created a humanitarian crisis. Basic supplies ran short. Unemployment soared. The United Nations declared that Israel's withdrawal in 2005 did not end its responsibilities, since it still controlled Gaza's borders, airspace, and waters. Meanwhile, Hamas consolidated its power, pushing out rivals and strengthening its armed wing. The Qassam brigades, Iran became Hamas's most important ally. Tehran provided funding, weapons, and military training, helping the group build up its arsenal of rockets and drones. But Iran's strategy went far beyond Gaza. In Lebanon, it armed and financed Hezbollah, which became a powerful military and political force. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias gained influence after the US invasion, and in Yemen, Iran supported the Houthi movement in its fight against a Saudi-led coalition. By the early 2010s, Israel increasingly saw Gaza not just as a local threat, but as part of a broader Iranian network stretching across the Middle East. By the late 2000s, Gaza had become the epicenter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 2008, after months of rocket fire from Gaza and Israeli airstrikes, Israel launched Operation Cast Leader, a 3-week war that left over 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis dead. In 2012, a new cycle of rocket fire and airstrikes plunged Gaza and southern Israel into another brief war. 2 years later, the conflict exploded again. In 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge after Hamas intensified its rocket attacks and cross-border raids. It was the longest and most destructive war in Gaza since Israel's withdrawal in 2005. During these years, Hamas developed an extensive network of underground tunnels. Some were used to smuggle goods into Gaza under the blockade. Others served as military tunnels for moving fighters and launching attacks into Israeli territory. The wars devastated Gaza's infrastructure and deepened the isolation of its population. At the same time, Hamas's military capabilities continued to grow, supported by Iranian funding and technology. After years of failed peace talks and repeated wars in Gaza, Israel's political landscape shifted sharply to the right. Benjamin Netanyahu became the country's longest-serving prime minister, leading successive coalitions with nationalists and religious parties. Settlement expansion accelerated across the West Bank, and laws passed in 2018 declared Israel the nation-state of the Jewish people, sparking outrage among Palestinians and Israel's Arab citizens. Far-right figures, once on the margins of Israeli politics, gained influence. Leaders like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich pushed for harsher crackdowns on Palestinians and annexation of parts of the West Bank. This political shift hardened Israeli policies and left little room for negotiations. For many Palestinians, hopes for a two-state solution began to fade, replaced by deepening frustration and calls for new forms of resistance. While Israel's politics moved to the right, Palestinians turned to diplomacy and international advocacy. The State of Palestine had been officially declared by the Palestine Liberation Organization in November 1988, and most recognitions came soon after. By the early 2020s, nearly 140 countries recognized Palestine as a state. In recent years, a smaller wave came from European and Latin American countries. Sweden, Ireland, Spain, and Norway joined the list, signaling growing frustration with Israel's occupation policies. In 2012, the United Nations granted Palestine non-member observer status, opening the door for joining UN agencies and the International Criminal Court. At the same time, civil society movements gained momentum. The Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions (BDS) campaign, launched in 2005, called on businesses, artists, and governments to pressure Israel. Universities, trade unions, and cultural figures around the world joined the movement. Mass protests in cities like London, Paris, and New York demanded Palestinian rights. For many, the conflict became a global symbol of injustice, but Israel denounced BDS as anti-Semitic and passed laws to counter it. Western governments remained divided, some supporting Palestinian aspirations, others reaffirming their ties with Israel. In 2017, US President Donald Trump broke with decades of American policy by recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the US embassy there. For Israel, it was a historic victory. For Palestinians, it felt like a final blow to hopes for a future capital in East Jerusalem. 3 years later, Trump brokered the Abraham Accords, a series of normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Supporters hailed the deals as a new era of Middle East peace and cooperation, but Palestinians saw them as a betrayal by Arab governments, breaking the long-standing principle of no recognition of Israel until Palestinian statehood. Behind the scenes, Iran's growing influence pushed some Gulf states closer to Israel, creating an unlikely alliance against a shared enemy. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a surprise attack on southern Israel. Militants crossed the border, killing over 1,200 people and taking hundreds of hostages back to Gaza. For Israel, it was the deadliest single day in its history. Israel responded with massive airstrikes on Gaza, followed by a ground invasion. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals, schools, and refugee camps came under fire. By mid-2024, more than 35,000 Palestinians had been killed, including over 14,000 children. According to Gaza health officials, as the fighting dragged on, a humanitarian catastrophe unfolded. More than 2 million Gazans were trapped, facing shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. The international community was deeply divided. Western allies defended Israel's right to respond to Hamas's attack, while others accused Israel of disproportionate force and possible war crimes. As the war in Gaza dragged on, outrage spread across the globe. Images of mass civilian casualties and widespread destruction fueled protests in capitals from London to Jakarta. Humanitarian workers and journalists also paid a heavy price. Aid convoys were repeatedly struck, killing dozens of UN staff and NGO volunteers. Reporters described Gaza as one of the deadliest conflict zones for journalists in decades. In early 2024, South Africa filed a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing it of committing genocide in Gaza. While the court stopped short of declaring genocide, it ordered Israel to take immediate steps to prevent further civilian harm. At the same time, the International Criminal Court's prosecutor requested arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as senior Hamas leaders, on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution describing Israel's occupation and settlement policies as a form of apartheid, a move celebrated by Palestinians but rejected by Israel and its allies. The international system itself seemed paralyzed. While Western powers continued to defend Israel's actions as self-defense, much of the global South rallied behind the Palestinians, deepening the world's divisions. Today, the conflict stands at a dangerous crossroads. The Palestinians remain deeply divided. Gaza is controlled by Hamas, while the West Bank is under Fatah's weakened authority. The Palestinian leadership struggles to effectively govern its territory as Gaza faces a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. With its overwhelmingly young population and years of siege and displacement, the risk of further radicalization grows. Internationally, Palestine has gained broader media attention and increasing support from citizens in Western countries, pressuring governments in the US, UK, and EU to reconsider their policies. More states have recognized Palestinian statehood, but on the ground, those recognitions have brought little change. Israel, meanwhile, maintains overwhelming military superiority, but it is no longer invulnerable. The October 2023 attack shattered its sense of security. Though Israel achieved military victories against Iran's proxies in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, and signed historic agreements with Arab states, it faces new challenges. Its political alliances in the West are strained. Tensions with international institutions like the UN, ICC, and ICJ have deepened. At home, Israeli society is increasingly polarized between hardliners and those seeking a negotiated settlement. Decades of war and failed diplomacy have left both sides trapped. For the Palestinians, the threat of apartheid and ongoing allegations of crimes against humanity loom large. For Israel, the question remains whether military dominance can ever deliver lasting peace.